All right, so every year, the last couple of years, instead of making a New Year's resolution, I make a faith goal. So 2020, in 2020, I made the faith goal of asking God to help me understand His love better. And I often tell people that one of the ways in which God helped me understand His love more experientially was through the love of the people in the Brussels church, in a way that I'd never experienced love from a church before. And this continues to be demonstrated even a year after I've left. Several of you, after finding out that I was speaking at Vespers, reached out to me over text with really kind words and offers to pray for me. And I really, really appreciate it, because I certainly need it every time I speak. While I make the faith goal, for example, on understanding God's love last year, I didn't learn everything about God's love in 2020. I don't think that's the aim of it. But there were areas in which God wanted me to have a different understanding of His love and to fix misunderstandings about His love. So He worked on those areas. And I don't know how many of you know or have noted the ways in which God specifically loves you. I wanted to share just a quick anecdote on one of the ways in which God loves me. Some of you know that I have a fear of flying that started in 2010. After an extremely turbulent flight from the United States to Accra, Ghana. And then this was also the same year before I actually joined the Foreign Service, which was going to require me to travel all the time. And I had loved flying before then. I'd even wanted to be a pilot, for a commercial airline. Those of you who know my height know that that would probably never have happened, but it was a dream. And then the incident happened, and it became quite tragic because I hated getting on planes after that. But whenever I fly, I always try to get the window seat because it calms me to look out the window and see the clouds. And so when I moved to Brussels in 2017, as I do each time I get on a flight, I requested the window seat. But this time I didn't get one. And instead they sat me in the middle seat. And I was really, really upset with God. I told him, I was like, you know my anxieties, I've cast them upon you and you gave me the middle seat. And so I was fuming, I was upset, I boarded the plane and I took my seat and sat in the middle, and I was texting back and forth with a friend of mine, and I was asking her, I'm like, how do I get the guy to my right to keep his window open the whole flight? He had already shut it down once. My friend said, just ask him, see what he says. And so after I mustered up enough courage, I told him I was a bit nervous of flying and asked him if he would, and it helped to keep the window open. So I asked him whether or not he would leave it open. He graciously agreed, and I was grateful. And then for the next several hours, I basically kept my neck craned to the right, staring right past him and onto the clouds. And he must have felt extremely awkward with me looking his way the entire time. So then during the meal service, the guy to my left, this really tall American, must have been extremely uncomfortable in the seat because he had extremely long legs. He turns to me and he says, "Are you okay?" And I was like, oh man, he must have noticed me staring out the window the whole time. So I sighed and I said, "I'm a nervous flyer." And he said, "Yeah, my wife is as well." And so we proceeded to talk for the next couple of hours and found out that we were both going to be working for the US government at various NATO headquarters. And it turned out that one of his best friends was one of the people I respect most at the State Department, and someone who I had just worked with. And the guy was also a pilot in the Air Force and had been in some pretty crazy places. So every time I would worry about the turbulence on the plane, I would just calmly look to my left, and if he seemed calm, I would become calm. And one of the things over the years since my flight phobia began in 2010, God has given me several pilots as seatmates. And it makes me smile every time because it reminds me of how much he loves me. And as the flight was landing, the gentleman, he's getting up, he's getting his bags, and he says to me, "Well, if I get into a bar fight, you're the only person I know in Brussels, so you might be getting a call from me." I laughed and I was like, "Oh, I asked him whether he had a ride home, and he said that some folks would be picking him up." And as I come into the receiving area, I'm waiting for, of course, the embassy folks to come pick me up. And I see him walk up to several people who were there waiting for him. And I was like thinking to myself, now I thought he said he didn't know anyone in Brussels. So that night I'd remembered his name, and I Googled him. And there I come to realize that I'd been sitting next to a 2-star US Air Force general who was going to be taking up a command at SHAPE headquarters in Casto. And several weeks later, when NATO had its first meeting after the summer break, everyone had gathered for the big meeting. The Secretary General opens up the meeting, and then he hands it over to the person who's going to give the first briefing, which happens to be my seatmate. And later on, he came up to see the US ambassador, and he saw me in her office, and he smiled, came up and chatted. And I think back to my conversation with God before boarding the plane back in 2017 about why he would not give me the window seat, and why he gave me that middle seat, and I remember thinking, like, why didn't he love me enough to give me what was best for me? And then God reminds me, as he always does, that he gives me experiences where he shows me how uniquely he loves me and how he knows me best. So this year, after thinking for a bit, I was thinking about the faith goal, and I selected Mark 9:23 through 25 as the goal. And so the verses say, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. And the particular verse of focus for me was verse 24 that said, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And just for context, for those of you who have not heard the story or are not too familiar with the context of the story, in Matthew 9, Mark 9, and Luke 9, the Bible relays the story of a father of a young man who has severe epilepsy. And he's also got a spirit that has overtaken his body. He's deaf, he's mute. And every time he has an epileptic episode, he causes himself great danger, and he often gets hurt. And so Jesus approaches the multitude in which the father is standing, and he's with Peter, James, and John, because they have all just come down from the mountain where they watched Christ being transfigured. And the father calls out to Christ, explaining the problem that his son has. And in the meantime, he also informs Christ that, hey, I tried getting help from your disciples to cure my boy, but they were powerless to do anything. And so Christ says to the group, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you?" And then the father asks Jesus for mercy, for compassion, and for help. And in doing so, Christ asks him, or says to him, if you believe, all things are possible for him who believes. And in Mark 9:24, the Bible says, immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Jesus then rebukes the unclean spirit within the young boy, healing him of the convulsions. And later on, the disciples asked Jesus why they were unable to cast out the spirit. And so Christ responds, as the story shared in Matthew and Mark, that this kind of work needs to be done with prayer and fasting. And in Matthew's version, Christ also adds, because of your unbelief. For I assuredly say unto you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. Many of you have probably heard sermons on these chapters and the story many times. Some people choose to focus on the father and his unbelief. Some people choose to focus on the unbelief of the disciples, or perhaps of the multitude. And some people focus on the verse about faith being like a mustard seed. Regardless of where you choose to focus in the story, the key theme remains unbelief or faith. And I chose this verse as my goal this year, or understanding this better this year, because I know that I have rested in particular areas of unbelief in my Christian journey, which I could not get past. And for those of you who don't know, I grew up in an Adventist home, but I never had a relationship with Christ. I got baptized in high school. I don't remember why, but my heart never changed as a result of the baptism. And then between 2003 and 2006, following a crisis in my life, one of the questions I started exploring was whether there was a God. And I didn't believe that there was one at that time. The Christian faith, according to me, was something people made up to somehow make it through life. It gave them hope, and that's all there was to it. In the meantime, I had been trying to leave a teaching career to begin one in international affairs. Only nothing I tried was getting me on that path to the job in the field. I really wanted to get into a top 10 graduate school in international affairs, but my grades in undergraduate had been so bad that I thought the only way I was going to get into a good school was to do really well on the graduate school entrance exam. And so I studied for 2 weeks and I took the exam, and I did relatively well, but I needed a better score. So I left the teaching job. I moved to another state to stay with a friend of mine who had just started grad school. And I spent 3 months full-time studying for the exam. So the day of the exam, I go to the computer center, I begin the test. And back then, you could tell how you were doing on the quantitative reasoning portion of the exam, because for every question you answered correctly, if you were answering questions correctly in a series, the computer would continue generating harder questions. If you didn't answer it correctly, the questions would eventually become easier and easier as the computer was trying to analyze where your median understanding was. And so My eyes started tearing up in the middle of the exam as I realized my questions were getting easier and easier. And by the time I finished the exam, I got to my car and I was crying so hard. All these dreams I had of going to a really good graduate school or a career in international affairs completely disappeared. And I went to my bedroom, I closed the door, and I cried for just about 24 hours. And the next day in my room, I remember seeing somewhere on the floor, as if it appeared out of nowhere, this old church bulletin that I had somehow saved. And on it, there was a verse from 1 Samuel 3:5. And it said, "Here I am, for you called me." And there was young Samuel's words to the high priest Eli, when in fact it was God who was calling him, but Samuel hadn't recognized it. So that moment, my eyes filled with tears again, and I lifted up my hands and I said to a God I didn't know well, "If you're out there, take control of my life." And since that day, I've been on a nonstop and crazy, in a good way, journey with God. I got into the top 10 graduate school. I got some of the most prestigious internships while in school. I ended up in the career in international affairs, none of which makes sense for a girl who did so poorly in undergrad and had no one with context to help get anywhere along the road. In fact, most people actually kept trying to shut doors in my face, and God would somehow or the other push them open. After I reached out to God that day and said, "Take control of my life," I began attending church in the area where I was. And I drank in the Bible. God would show me different areas of my life over time to surrender to Him, a concept that I had never previously understood, and I would do it. And when He told me He wanted me in specific assignments for work, I would take them. And I have left family and friends countless times because I know that that's what God has asked me to do. And loneliness has been a companion of mine many, many times. But He has led me to amazing friends and communities, both at work and church, including at Brussels. I studied the Bible, I taught the Bible, I joined and led ministries, all at His leading and through earnest prayer. You see, when I invited God to lead my life, He knew that there were so many things about Him that I didn't understand. But through countless miraculous experiences, He kept on confirming that He was who He said He was in the Bible. And I know that the things in my life were not coincidences. I knew that someone was leading me, and I wanted to know Him and to do only what His will was for my life. But there remained areas of unbelief. And God knew that better than I did. There were times I would quietly wonder, is He really real? And there were certain areas of my life in which I hadn't come into a full trusting relationship with Him. And even as He would lead me sometimes so clearly, I would doubt the outcome. I would keep bracing myself for failure. I kept protecting myself from what I was sure would be inevitable pain. It's something I thought God didn't want me to have. And sometimes things did happen in the way I wanted it, or sometimes it wouldn't occur at all. But if things didn't happen, there was always a reason He had, and He always seemed to make it clear to me, and I agreed with Him. Yet I would keep on asking for things in prayer, and at the same time, keeping one hand up, kind of waiting for a negative outcome. So earlier this year, I came to so after I gave the faith goal, and it's funny, when you make these goals with Christ, He really, really leads you to a journey of understanding whatever it is that goal is. So earlier in the year, I came to a place where God was asking me to do something extremely challenging for me. And week after week, I would agree, and week after week, the outcome would yield some success and a whole lot of pain. And I prayed and I prayed, and I would claim verse after verse, and I would keep asking God to lift the burden from me. And when the results were not showing, I doubted whether I had heard Him correctly in the first place. I started doubting whether I had made this whole God thing up the entire time, and I was slowly losing confidence in the verses that I was trying so hard to claim and to believe in, because each verse had a promise, and I was slowly losing confidence in all of them. And on my wall in front of me here, this is where I usually sit for work. I've been teleworking the last year. I had taped a number of verses that I had been trying to use to encourage me along this journey, including verses like the following from Deuteronomy 31:8. And the Lord, He is the one who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear nor be dismayed. Or Hebrews 12:1-2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Or Philippians 4:6-7, one which many of you know, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and mind through Christ Jesus. I would also claim Psalm 137:7-8. Though I walk in the midst of trouble, you will revive me. You will stretch out your hand against the wrath of my enemies, and your right hand will save me. The Lord will perfect that which concerns me. Your mercy, O Lord, endures forever. Do not forsake the works of your hands. Philippians 4:19, and my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. Psalm 16:8, I have set the Lord before me, always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Not leaving me or forsaking me felt like a passive action from God. He was standing by my side somewhere, but he wasn't doing anything to help. I kept looking at him as the author and perfecter of my faith, but there was no increase in my faith. The peace that passeth all understanding was completely elusive to me by that point. He wasn't meeting my needs, and I was constantly being shaken. And of course, none of this was God's fault. I would read the verses, have some comfort about the problem, pray, then something would happen, and I would turn my focus back to the overwhelming problem and sink down again, till I couldn't handle it anymore. And one day I cried out to him and I said, enough. Enough with the promises. I can't read them anymore. I can't believe in them anymore. What is the point of each one? That day, God brought me to the junction where I had to decide whether to continue moving forward with him or whether I was done. Did I believe what I preached about God? I was not going to be a hypocrite about my faith. I was not going to share with people to trust in his word if I myself could not. What I didn't realize is that God had brought me face to face with all the areas in which I had been complacent about my unbelief in him and the word. The areas in me where I didn't fully trust or believe him and hadn't worked out for myself with fear and trembling. I was disgusted with myself and I had no idea what to do next. So I did the only thing I knew to do. Even in my unbelief, I prayed. It's the one thing God has taught me to do the last 15 years. Keep praying. I was completely beaten down and worn out, and I didn't want to fight God. I don't know how many of you have ever watched the movie Rocky with Sylvester Stallone. It's an old series of movies about a boxer, or any movie about boxing, where the hero gets knocked down in a bloody fight and there's no hope of him or her getting up. But somehow someone or something encourages the fighter. He sees a face in the audience and he gets to his knees. He gets up with renewed strength and he deals the last few blows and he fights and he wins. God wasn't going to give up on me, and that's what I felt like. And in that moment, he reminded me with flash after flash of scenes from the last 15 years of how he had led me. And I realized that even if I wanted to get back to that place of unbelief that I had been in 15 years earlier, I couldn't anymore. Somehow, over the last 15 years, God, who spoke the worlds into existence, who lived as a man on earth, went to the cross for me and resurrected 3 days later and was preparing a place for me to spend eternity with him. I didn't realize how strongly I had come to believe in that God until I was forced to face what I did and didn't believe. What about the other area of unbelief in my life? Trusting 100% that he was good regardless of my circumstances. Over the next few months, God lifted me off the floor, and I came to a place where yesterday's lessons were for yesterday, and I would beg him to show me what he wanted from me today. What are you saying to me today? What promises are you asking me to claim today? Because yesterday's strength is not enough for me today. When I wake up in the mornings, I pray and ask him to speak, telling him that there's not one day that should go by where I don't hear your voice. And he speaks. Through the word, through his providences, through people, sermons, and many other ways. And there were two things he showed me over and over again in answer to why he had allowed the things that passed to occur. Over a course of 4 days, Earlier this summer, 5 separate and distinct, unrelated times, he showed me what he was doing with me. Some of you know the verse from Malachi 3:3, which all of a sudden showed up and then kept showing up. He sits as a refiner and purifier of silver, to purify and refine them like silver and gold. Nearly every other verse on the purification in the furnace and fire showed up the next few days. I hear you, Lord, I hear you. Give me the strength to make it through this time in which you are purifying my faith and areas of unbelief. And on the things in my areas, there are so many areas in which my life was at a crossroads where numerous decisions needed to be made. And every verse in the Bible on waiting would somehow appear over and over and over. I have waited on God countless times in the past, but only once had I done it before at his command that I heard so distinctly. And now I was hearing it again in 3 separate areas of my life. Wait. One of the more recent verses he repeated twice on waiting was from Habakkuk 2:3. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. For though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. What God promises, he will carry out. He's still taking my areas of unbelief and molding them into trust. I would love to tell you that the journey has reached some sort of a conclusion and that verse is now completely embodied in me. It's not yet, but I am more confident in his promises today than I've ever been in my life. I have been more confident in hearing his voice than I've ever been in my life. I don't know if God has brought you face to face with what you believe about him and whether you genuinely believe it. I don't know what areas of unbelief you rest in when it comes to God, what promises of his you think are not meant for you or your loved ones. I read Hebrews 12:1-2 earlier. Part of it says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. I wonder if any of you can tell me what that joy is that he was referring to, or that is being referred to in that verse. If you think about it, when it says, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, what's the joy that he's referring to? It's us. You are Christ's joy. You are the reason he endured the cross. His love for you is the reason he wants to perfect your faith in him. God is the one who gives us faith. God is the one who gives us the promises. It's on him to do the work. We just have to allow him to do it. I would encourage you to ask him what areas of unbelief there are in your life and ask him to help you in that unbelief. He won't let you give up on him. He didn't with me. He didn't even let me do it for 24 hours. I want to tell you how lovingly God wove all the lessons he was teaching me this year into a couple of moments most recently. I don't know how many of you know the show on Hope Channel called Hope Sabbath School. It's, as the pastor says, it's an in-depth interactive study on the Bible, and it goes through the weekly lesson in the quarterly, and it's broadcast to over 100 countries. When I first arrived to Washington last year, some well-meaning friends of mine tried figuring out ways to get me on the show without my permission. And the reason was because they figured if I was put on TV, I could get a husband. And some of you are saying, oh, great idea. I was so angry with them, putting me on display on TV so I could get a man. No, thank you. And one of the areas I've had to put into God's hand on leading is bringing me together with a partner. So when all the methods my friends were trying to get me on the show failed, they finally gave up. And I remember telling God, I would never go on that show to find a man. If he ever had a testimony, though, about my conversion that he wanted to share through me, he could lead me as he desired. And before coming to Brussels, I had prayed about which church to join when I came back. I'd had a church that I'd been going to for in previous years, and I didn't feel led back to that same church. And then God clearly led me elsewhere. I joined a Sabbath school. I'm the youngest person in that Sabbath school class by about 20 years, but I've been so blessed and I've kept on attending week after week. And one day the gentleman leading the group asked me to stay back, and this is all virtually, and he said, Nisha, I think you would make a good candidate for an international Sabbath school show. And I knew exactly what show he was referring to. It was the Hope Sabbath School. And I respected him a lot, so I told him, you're welcome to submit my name to Derek Morris, who's the president of a Hope Channel, and Derek's wife is actually the one who coordinates who gets on the show. So I thought about saying no to the informal interview, and then I remembered saying to God, if you have a testimony you want me to share, I'll do it. So they decided to bring me onto the team. And then when the call went out for who would be able to help with the taping, so they do the taping several months in advance, right? So the January quarterly is actually on Hebrews. They tape the show in August. So I picked episodes based on my weekend availability and work schedule. And they eventually scheduled me for four tapings. And then Derek will, or his wife will send the lessons ahead of time so that you can prep ahead of the show taping. I looked at the lesson for episode 1 and I laughed out loud. Question 1, part C. What is your conversion story? Now, there are 8 other people on the show with me. So whether Derek is going to call on me when he asked that question was going to be left to God. You'll actually have to watch the show to figure out whether he did. The truth is, it didn't matter, because in even seeing that question on the sheet, I knew that the opportunity was God-led. The last episode I taped last weekend was on lesson 11. Without knowing it, I had signed up for the episode on Hebrews chapters 11 and 12, Jesus, author and perfecter of our faith. I laughed again when I saw the lesson outline, and I saw 2 questions pertaining to 2 verses God had led me to the previous months, which I had failed to connect to Hebrews. The first question tied Hebrews 10, verses 37 to 38, with Habakkuk 2, verse 3 and 4 on waiting on God, knowing that he would not tarry. The second question asked the following question: is Mark 9:24 a prayer we can also pray? Mark 9:24 was my faith goal this year. I know you're leading, Lord. I know you're leading. I know you keep reminding me that you will never leave me or forsake me. And that is not a passive verse. God isn't just standing by us as he watches us drown. He is actively working on our behalf to help us. The study in Hebrews tied faith, unbelief, and perseverance. He also reminded me of my faith goal in 2020 last year. Lord, let me understand your love. All these faith goals, after all, are interconnected. Friends, I would say to all of you, I would say persevere in whatever areas of unbelief you are wrestling with today. The walk of faith is not easy, but take heart, as he reminds us in John 16:33. He has overcome the world.